Welcome back to another classic album review. This is where I do a deep dive into, those albums that really helped shape the landscape of music or just really stood out, those masterpiece albums and whatnot that I don't normally talk about since I try to talk about new releases and whatnot. But yeah, in August, I like to shine the light on those albums that really help shape my own musical journey and, the music that I love to listen to, as well as just, those prominent standout albums that I think most people should know about. So, yeah, today we're looking at one that came out well over a decade ago. Yet I think a lot of people would still consider this a more new record, especially when a lot of those classic albums that I like to talk about generally come out in like the 60s and 70s. So let's dive into an album that really helped revolutionize as well as solidify more of the modern neo-prog. Let's dive in. Night by Gazpacho. So Gazpacho is a Norwegian progressive rock band getting their start in the, late 90s and then putting out their first album in 2003 with Bravo. And Night is their fourth full-length album after Bravo, When Earth Lets Go, and The Firebird. And these three albums, I feel like it was them getting the ground beneath their feet. It was them kind of figuring out who they were in the early 2000s progressive rock landscape, and it wasn't really until Night that they really found their stride and hit the ground running. And many people would consider this album as their best album. It kind of goes back and forth between this one and the follow-up the next year of TikTok, or I guess TikTok came out in 2009. As I mentioned, this is the one that really got them onto the stage, and what really does it for me is the overall atmosphere. This was one thing that Gazpacho was playing with quite a bit within their early albums, is creating ambience and atmosphere within the sounds and within the soundscapes. A lot of that is with the overlay of synths and guitars, as well as the really dripping and haunting vocals of Jan Henrik Orm. His vocals are very similar to the H style of singing from Marillion. It's got this kind of lullaby, sing-song, raspy aspect to it. It's not bombastic. It's not, very big or shouty or anything like that. It's very subdued and very mellow. And that soundscape can kind of be found throughout the entire runtime of this album. And even though it's 5 tracks long, they really do blend into one singular piece of music. And this album is all about dreams. It's all about, interpreting reality. And the album opens and closes with this dialogue of, reality is completely subjective and our mind's the only thing to interpret it. And that kind of lays the groundwork, especially when you're dreaming, are dreams real? And, because everything is subjective in that sense, where do you have this reality and unreality, right? Like this was very Inception before Inception became a thing. So the other thing is that these guys at this point were not shy of the longer stretches of music. I mean, this track opens up of Dream of Stone, which is a very brave move for these boys to open up because it's 17 minutes and it's the biggest kind of build track that I've really heard for a while. It takes a long time for things to get going. And a lot of this can mirror the stages of sleep. And it feels like when you're trying to fall asleep, the longest stretch is that time between going to bed and finally falling asleep. And this kind of gray area of when dreaming actually starts, So it takes a very long time for this track to actually find its grounding and get going. The whole thing is really driven by this very simplistic doont, 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 doont. And that really beat is kind of the heartbeat throughout the entire album, but really that is what drives this track. And it's very hypnotic, it's very meditative, it's very trance-like, and after a while you kind of forget that you are, listening to this music as it's kind of lulled you into this kind of false sense of security, because this track has quite a number of crescendos and quite a number of buildups and payoffs. It kind of reminds me of Lark's Tongue and Aspect Part 1 from King Crimson, and the first track, or the first 2 tracks off of King Crimson's Island. In fact, Islands is a perfect metaphor for this album where, it takes its time. There's a lot of space, a lot of breath. And so if the album opens up with the 17-minute track, there are two other touchstones, 3 tracks in total, including the first one, that are quite lengthy. You know, the middle track of Upside Down being 9 minutes and 41 seconds, very similar to Dream of Stone in that it's this build up. And once again, we're kind of lulled into this. And what I really love is that play out by that midpoint where it really, really does stretch its legs, and we've got this beautiful play out, this beautiful jam session that's not bombastic, not incredible, like not, explosive or anything, but the playing styles between the keyboards and that lead guitar, and that lead guitar is so pristine and so like beautiful. It's very Gilmour-esque in the playing styles. It's not 1,000 notes per second, but it really does lay down the notes that needs to be played at that time so incredibly well. And then the final track of Massive Illusion is the other large track at 13 and a half minutes. And really, Massive Illusion, I think, is it's the reason why people love coming to this album. It's such a brilliant track. And again, it's all built on that big climb. It's that gradual climb that gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then this massive crescendo right at the end that really does usher the rest of the track home. And once again, it's almost a religious experience, especially when we're talking about, when we get to the big climax of the track. And just that final lyric of this album and this track, which it's a religious experience. It really is. It's got every reason to believe that all must decide to break free. Was it a tantrum when you said that all the laughs were on me? Then I'll know my bet will win when the saints go marching in, go marching in. And it's this massive, massive release, this cathartic release that, it's such a brilliant and beautiful ending of this track. And then throughout this, kind of sandwiched between those 3 big tracks, we've got 2 smaller tracks in around the 6-minute mark. Checkered Light Buildings, which really is just a little bit of a breather. It's a little bit somber, but even this has a brilliant and beautiful crescendo. And same with Valerie's Friend, which again is a little bit of a breather, a little bit of a break, but itself has a brilliant and beautiful crescendo by the end. So each track really does have this build-up and payoff, and it really does solidify what it was about progressive rock that made me love it so much. It's these build-ups, it's these payoffs, it's the atmosphere and the energy, it's the environment that they're playing in. They're pushing the music forward. They're really trying and playing with new things that really haven't been discovered at that point, and utilizing it and recontextualizing it in such a way that creates such a pleasant and beautiful listen from start to finish. So yeah. Now the last thing that I really wanted to talk about this album, outside that it's an absolute masterpiece, if you haven't listened to it by now, you absolutely have to. I remember really getting into this album when I was studying for my undergrad and being kind of awake in the very early hours, not being able to settle, first time away from home, not knowing how to really reclaim my independence, and taking this album along with TikTok into the student common area of campus, like of the university that I was living in, and just sitting on one of the oversized couches and listening to this album at like midnight or 1 o'clock, where, you still had a few students that were on campus kind of walking through and doing things. So I was still kind of a part of the overall, energy and landscape that was the campus at that time. But I was still far enough removed that I could kind of keep to myself. So it gave me the comfort of other people, but the security knowing that I didn't have to interact with them. So I just remember having vivid memories of listening to this, as well as Sky Moves Sideways from Porcupine Tree, while, I was having those kind of homesickness kind of moments in my life, and, panic attacks, for lack of a better term. But the last thing I wanted to mention is, there's 2 versions of this album. You have the original release that came out in 2007, and then the remastered version that came out a little bit later on. And it's very interesting because they're almost 2 very different versions of this album. I mean, the songs are the same, but the way that this album has been remixed and remastered, it provides a completely different experience. On the one hand, the remastered version is much more lush. It's a lot more full. It's got a much bigger sound dynamic across the board. There's a lot more interesting things going on in the production side, but those big crescendos that I was talking about in my actual review are kind of softened. It's almost as though they took away all the sharp edges and blunted everything and polished it up into this very pristine shine. And because of that, those punches, those big crescendos are softened, and I'm not as much of a fan of that. So on the one hand, it's got a much more lush and dynamic experience on the remastered. But on the other hand, it's got a softened blow on some of those big crescendos. So yeah, it really depends on how I feel when I want to listen to this album, because more often than not, I'll go to the original recording of this album just to get that really big movement. It's much more of like a religious experience in that sense, rather than listening to the technical side of this album. So yeah, that's my only last little thought about this album. It was a very interesting way that they did remaster this, in that, like I said, it sounds like a whole new album. Very similar to what Flower Kings did this past year with a lot of their albums. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on Night by Gazpacho. If you haven't heard it already, please go ahead and do so. This is the kind of album that I feel like pretty much anybody can enjoy, regardless if you're a prog fan or not. Again, that first track really, like, if you can get past that first track and you can find enjoyment off of it, you're going to love the rest of the album. If you find that first track just a little tedious and a little tiresome, maybe skip right to the second track. But yeah, my opinion, you got to listen to the whole thing. You have to listen to the whole thing. But yeah, that's it for me for Gazpacho and their album Night. What did you guys think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. And thank you all so much for watching. I've been having a blast doing these kind of classic albums. It kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off because I am so familiar with these albums. I'll listen to them a couple times before I sit down and, talk about it. But it's not like a new album review where I always feel the pressure to get as many listens in on it as I possibly can before I have to get an album review out. So I can kind of take my time with these a little bit more. And that's what I've been doing. So yeah, like I said, thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.